I'm Miwa Messer. I'm the producer and host of Port Over, and it's 2025. And more importantly, I get to talk to Imani Perry today. And South to America, winner of the National Book Award, deservedly so. And maybe I was the one banging on the table when Imani's name was announced. It's a book that I love. It's a book that explains America. If you haven't read it yet, please go back and pick it up. The new book, Black and Blues. And Imani, I'm going to quote you as we start this, because you talk about blue as a portal.
Mm-hmm.
And I actually want to start there. I want to start with the color blue, and then we're going to move into how this book evolved and everything else. Happy New Year. I'm happy to see you.
I'm so happy to see you. And thank you for this conversation.
But blue is a portal.
Yeah, it's a literal metaphor. It starts in my grandmother's bedroom. That's where the book starts.
Yep.
Grandmother's bedroom, which was blue, and she had a blue comforter and a picture of bluebirds on the wall. And I asked my cousin's son what his favorite color blue is, because he's blue like I do. And he points to this square where there was a ceiling tile where it had been dropped. He points to one of the tiles that's been taken out. And he says, that one, you can look through that square and see the original color blue it had been painted.
Mm-hmm.
And it was much more vibrant than the blue we grew up with. It just resonated so deeply, because interior space, it was very important to me. My grandmother was home, but it also, it resonated with the idea of the blue of the sky, the blue of the ocean, the blue of the seas. And so it's a color that becomes sort of this pathway into thinking about history and the worlds that we are cast into, and the ones we create, which in some ways is what the book is, right? Because it's a story about Blackness, which is not something that was. We take it for granted, right? But being Black, right? Black people are now Black, or phenotypically, were all sorts of things, right? Historically, before the transatlantic slave trade. So I'm thinking about Blackness as something that began out of tragedy, the tragedy of the transatlantic slave trade, the tragedy of the history of slavery, the history of colonialism, history of conquest. And this is in some ways, a sea epic, right? That is, it happens through encounters with the water that are terrifying and tragic. And yet there's also this history of people who are cast into this category, turning it into something beautiful and meaningful. And doing so in part by a kind of different relationship with the skies and the water, and even the very material which they're exchanged for as part of the slave trade, right? And that's where indigo comes in. And so the book is telling a story about a relationship to blue that is a way of telling a story about the history of what it meant for people to become Black, and also telling us something about what it means to be human, which is what I think is really what is extraordinary about the story. So that, there's something that human beings do in the face of utter devastation, which is imagine and create, that I think is absolutely extraordinary and something we particularly need right now.
And you pull from art, and you pull from music, and you pull from personal memoir, and you pull from the historical record. And this is one of the reasons I love reading your work. And part of why I still sit with South to America the way I sit with it, because you are doing this deeply intersectional investigation of us.
Yeah.
And your curiosity takes us down paths. I mean, yes, you start with your grandmother's bedroom, but like we get to Roberta Flack, and we get to Ralph Ellison, and we get to Miles Davis. And there's a storyteller too I'm going to ask you about later in the show. But we have all of these moments. Whitney Houston. All of these things where, and I'm going to quote you again for a second, you talk about how people see Blackness as something that's static, and yet it is ever changing and ever evolving. And if you look at all of these different lenses all of these different literature, music, physical art. It's really exciting the way this unfurls. But it's a really short book.
Yeah.
It's because when I'd heard that the project was coming, I was like, oh, okay. So, I'm thinking South to America size, right?
Yeah.
And then I get this tiny, elegant
yeah.
jotting, which, you don't really jot, right? Like, I really do think that everything comes out of you in full sentences, full paragraph, full ideas. And I know that's not how the process works. But can we talk about the creation of this book? Because I know it starts with memory.
Yeah.
But there's so much more going on.
It is, yes. It starts with memory. I'm an associative writer. And I talk a good deal about hoodoo, the kind of folk, quasi-ritual, quasi-religious, quasi-medicinal practices of the Black South, which is an associative practice itself, right? So I think of, in some ways, I'm a writer who comes out of the hoodoo tradition in the sense that I'm always trying to quilt, right? So the research is hard, right? There's a lot of digging. And then I have, thousands of documents sitting before me and either on the computer or at moments where I'm overwhelmed, they're on the floor somewhere, like, just map on the floor. And then trying to think, how do I put these pieces together? And it as a story. And initially I wasn't thinking in narrative terms. Like I was thinking chapter was going to be sort of a freestanding essay. It was going to be, that sort of conventional book of essays form. And it is, but I realized it had to have a kind of chronological component to it to do what I wanted it to do. And that meant that it became shorter in a sense because I'm trying to move across time and then also be in particular times and spaces as I'm moving across time, and to get the sort of balance, the rhythm of that, right? And there's a lot of musical influences.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
With everything I write, there's a lot of musical composition influences. But the thing about getting the pacing right meant that there are moments that were softer engagements with a time and place than what I might have done otherwise. And then that's the sort of the trying to figure out the craft when you're telling a story that has historical pieces in it. So it's a little bit about the process, but it was hard. There are some books that are it's always really fun, but there's some that are harder than others. This was hard for me to get to where I wanted it to be.
The work of remembering.
Mm-hmm.
The work of remembering, the way you talk about it, right? How we ascribe value to people and places and ideas. And there's a lot of work that went into this book. But I didn't feel like I was reading a treatise or a polemic. I felt like I was sort of listening to you riff about all of the different influences that made you the writer that I so enjoy reading, right? And I want to bring back a couple of books that not everyone always talks about, but Breathe, you wrote a book sort of like Baldwin's notes to his letter to his nephew, where you're sort of speaking to your two, at the time, young sons who are now men. And the biography of Lorraine Hansberry, which, she died at 34, which every time I think about that, I'm like, how is that even possible? She's just, this legacy of hers, right? And yet 34, what?
Yeah.
And I look at your body of work, right? I look at this body of work and I look at the way you pull from music and I look at the way you pull from art and other people's words and your own words and everything else. And we get this synthesis.
Mm-hmm.
And you get us to pay attention in new ways to ideas that maybe get a little overlooked because of the way we structure our thinking and our society and everything else.
Yeah.
And I'm wondering when you started working on the new book, Black and Blues, because I kind of feel like you've been walking around with all of this for a really long time.
Yeah. I've been working on this book for 4 years in earnest. but I would say for at least 7, I've been threads. So it actually started around the same time as South to America in terms of, and, there was this where I was collecting information for books at the same time. And then, of course, more of my attention went to that book first, but it was still in the background percolating. I have spiritual altars in my house. And so I found this piece of paper that I put on my altar that had both books on the altar about 7 years ago. But there's this thing about memory that I think is for me part of the kind of, I guess, the ethical question in terms of being a writer, in that what I'm trying to do with the past, because I'm not a conventional historian, or not a historian conventionally speaking, but I am in archives a lot, and I'm trying to structure my attention in ways that are ethical, in the sense that I'm trying to draw attention to moments and relations between human beings in such a way can function as a guide for us in terms of how to be in relation with each other now. So for me, for example, the moment where I am thinking about the slave ship, but thinking about not just the horrific conditions of the enslaved on the slave ship, but the white members of the crew who are facing horrific conditions, but not as horrific conditions, and what that proximity creates, right? Because it creates a kind of terror for the members of the crew about the prospect of being treated that poorly, and also a desire to be like the captain. And that, to me, is at the very heart of why, it becomes so hard for human beings to fully identify with each other's suffering, even though they're experiencing suffering together, sometimes from the same forces, right? And so I'm trying to use the sort of, we think about looking into the archives as memory work, I'm trying to do that work with a kind of ethical mandate.
Which is a really interesting way of approaching context, right? Like, there are people who will tell you the historical record appears as it is, and therefore that is the context.
Right.
Without thinking about maybe who wrote that record or what their agenda was, because human beings have agendas no matter what, You can fiddle with data and you can fiddle with perception. I mean, propaganda. You can tell a story and maybe 3 bears show up and, we've got Goldilocks and everything else. And you can tell a different kind of story and, countries get overrun. And watching how cultures learn to parse that information is wild to me. And part of why I like to read history, and not obviously as a historian, just as a bookseller and a reader and what have you, is just the idea that I might be able to pull a piece of information that I did not previously have. And how does that fit into sort of a conceptualization of the world and society and all of that? And does it fit, or is it, not a useful piece of information, but to have that ability to parse.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And it does, you have to be able to pull from different points of view in different places and different sources. And, I'm going to use Ralph Ellison. You tell this story about Ralph Ellison that makes, I love Invisible Man. It's a book that I hold very, very close to my heart. But Ellison, if you know his story, kind of at the end of his life really becomes everyone's angry grandpa.
Yeah.
He's much more conservative. He's like, what are you talking about? X, Y, and Z. Like, he kind of made me think of my grumpy grandpa.
Yeah.
But he's still Ralph Ellison, right? He's still the guy who created Invisible Man. And yet, towards the end of his life, he's just kind of grumpy grandpa. But we need the entire portrait of Ellison, right? Like, we don't pick and choose and say, oh, well, here's the piece that I love about him, and we're just going to forget the fact that, maybe he was, scratching his nose and saying some stuff where you're like, oh, grandpa. And if you read some of the later essays, it's like, oh.
Right, yes.
Hi. Sunday dinners would have been weird with you, but okay. But I love the idea that the complete portrait is there. Or, when you put Toni Morrison in juxtaposition with August Wilson. two monumental talents who are also kind of like, hey, we're not perfect. We're really not perfect. We're not looking
to be perfect.
Yeah, we're human and here we are. And I just, having all of these different pieces for me as a reader is hugely important. And even Miles Davis, where I go back and forth on Miles Davis, like the music is brilliant, but let's face it, he was not the easiest dude.
It's interesting. We have this moment. We're in such a strange moment because we're in a moment where people, they sort of gleefully take folks down, and we're also in a moment of a lot of hagiography and iconicity, right? Both are really troubling because they both are ways of evading the complexity of what it means to be a human being. And I always think we should turn to historic figures. Of course, they're inspiration, but they also can function as people who provide information about how we ought to conduct ourselves now, or how we envision conducting ourselves, or how we do the things that we want to do. And that requires a kind of tender sensitivity and a recognition of their complexity. And so that is how I try to take up these people, even the ones for whom I am completely overwhelmed and in love with in every possible way. And I've always tried, and I think that actually is more respectful than simply making them icons.
I also think this might be the first time I've ever heard anyone describe Miles Davis as a bourgeois dentist's son. I was like, oh.
Yeah.
Absolutely spot on, though. Absolutely spot on. But yeah, pretty much the first time I've ever heard him described in kind of that way. But I want to go back to you as the writer and the creator of this narrative and sort of who you land on and how you decide who gets included. I mean, obviously, I've dropped some pretty big names. Stokely Carmichael comes in at one point, and, there's a storyteller called Hugh Hill, Brother Blue. How do you decide who fits?
So this is such a good question because it really is like quilting or like a puzzle. So there are people who I'm still grieving who are no longer in the book, because it is, and I had, at a certain point, I had to say to myself, the book, everything that I say this over and over again, but I had to, every book that you write is an invitation. It's a beginning, not an end. So that the people who don't make it in, or the stories that don't make it in, are not gone. They're just not in this particular artifact. It doesn't work of art. So it is sort of iterative process, like seeing, well, what happens if I go from this person to this person, or this event to this event. That doesn't sound right, and so then I move something else in. That's the process. For me, part of that also required thinking about all of the aspects of the color blue and all of the aspects of blackness. Both, right? So that when I talk about how blue is this contrapuntal color, right? It's hot and cold. It's a symbol of beauty as well as despair. So how to get to all of that in different shades of blue, even, and then also how to get to this reality of the painful histories of racism and domination, and this extraordinary artistic tradition, and love and beauty and resilience and all those things around Blackness, knowing that all those pieces had to be tended to in each period that I was trying to move through. And then even thinking about the geography of Blackness, because even though I'm a person who studied the US, it doesn't have national borders. So how to sort of show the arteries of what it has meant to be Black globally. It's not a global history, but it at least wanted to point to the arteries and the connections. It's this, rearranging process. It's a moving in, moving out, restructuring, listening to it as, so this kind of the way that you alienate yourself from your writing as a writer, and listen to whether that sounds right. Do I buy that? If I didn't write that, would I buy it? Right. And so sometimes, and there are parts that were really precious that I actually wanted to keep in, that my editor, who is wonderful, Sarah Birmingham, no, this doesn't work, Imani. So even to also listening to someone I trust deeply about that was part of the process.
It's funny too, because one of the things that Black and Blues did for me too was sent me back to Hanif Abdurraqib's Little Devil in America. And it sent me back to Safiya Sinclair's poetry collection, Cannibal. And, she'd studied, I think, with Derek Walcott at one point, and Walcott also grumpy grandpa. Grumpy grandpa. Derek Walcott makes an appearance in Black and Blues as well. But the idea that you can all sort of sit in this orbit and share this orbit of influence and creativity, and where do we pull, but also stories of identity, but you cannot separate the art and the literature and the music and the poetry. You cannot separate the words from the actual thing itself. And, that's why I read, right? And I know you're a voracious reader outside of the work that you do. Like, we're always just trying to expand our worlds.
Yeah, I mean, I think of, it's funny, I was on another podcast where someone asked me, what book would you like to have written if you could have written? And my response was like, none. I'm a reader first.
Yeah.
It wouldn't take, I absolutely love that I get to read other people's work all the time. And it is, as you said, it's an expansion of our worlds. It's a way of being alive that I just cherish so much. So it's part of why I just can't even believe I'm so lucky that I get to write books. Like it's almost overwhelming every time about it because books mean so much to me.
But to go back to this earlier point that I borrowed from you, this idea that Blackness isn't static, right? Like how could anything, any human identity, how could it be static, right? And so our relationships to books, though, I mean, I remember being assigned Walcott in college and thinking, okay, I understand this is a major talent. Didn't really connect with him. But through the filter of Safiya Sinclair and Cannibal, I was like, oh, right, now I get it. And sometimes it takes a few decades before something really sinks in, right? Like there are times where you go back and you think about, the first time I read The Bluest Eye, I was an adolescent going into teenager. Was I too young? Yeah, absolutely. I was too young, but I knew I needed to read that book, right? As a brown kid growing up in very white suburbs, I was like, there was some of the book, obviously I didn't understand, but some of it I was like, oh, no, this makes perfect sense. I understand what I understood. And then you go back in your 20s and you get a different read, and then you go back again. The evolution of your relationship with a text. It's amazing.
Amazing. It is amazing. There's something about, I agree with you completely about that book. I actually have very mixed feelings even about teaching it.
Yeah.
Really hard to teach it well. And I've been really frustrated at times when I've taught it. The Bluest Eye is so much about witnessing. But we read it and we tend to think about the story of Pecola, but it really is also a story of Frida and Claudia and their feelings of disappointment in how the rest of the society treats the most vulnerable child as children, right? And so every time I read that book, I go into it and find myself surprised again and again about how much it sort of captures the brilliance and integrity of kids before the society has made them into the kind of people who we are in adulthood, where we become adjusted to cruelty. But it also is inspiring. I think I always am trying to figure out how to write something that can live beyond the present moment. And that, as you're saying, channels those who facilitated my creative development, not in a derivative way, but in a way that sort of is like playing, that is playing back something in my own voice they've offered. Yeah.
I've hinted at this a couple of times leading up to this moment, but Hugh Hill.
Yes.
You knew this woman called Ruth Hill, and I'm going to ask you to introduce Ruth to listeners too. But Hugh was also a storyteller, and as you say, he did a jazz version of King Lear, and he did sort of a blues version of Romeo and Juliet. And I'm thinking, well, if I'd had Shakespeare taught to me at a young age, as with that kind of approach, I might have had a different relationship to Shakespeare. Because again, my relationship with Shakespeare has evolved over time, right?
Okay.
And I was perfectly okay to ignore Shakespeare for a really long time. And now I'm like, yeah, all the devils are here. Okay. So But I'd love you to introduce Ruth and her husband to listeners, because I sort of feel like they're, in the way, a piece of the heart.
They're the heart
of this book.
They're the heart. Oh, I'm going to get emotional. So we moved to Massachusetts when I was 5 years old. And there's a sort of lifelong, maybe grief is too strong a word, but a wistfulness about having left the South. And, I've written before about the sort of ritual of return over the course of my life, but it was a very different environment. I met Ruth and Hugh Hill there in Massachusetts. And Ruth Hill she always wore all blue, and she was very much this sort of Black New England archetype, coming from an old family and very reserved and poised. She always had her knitting with her. And her husband was an incredibly popular storyteller in Cambridge, who was named Brother Blue. And he would tell stories. She worked at the Schlesinger Library. She created the Black Women's Oral History Project there. I didn't pay much attention to her as a child, but in retrospect, I realized one of the places he used to tell stories, which is right outside of the library where my mother used to go as a graduate student. He would stand on a hill and tell stories right across the street from where she worked. And he would tell these fantastic stories. He would tell, Jazz King Lear, and the most beautiful story he told was one about a butterfly, sort of about a caterpillar going into the chrysalis and then not knowing who he was until he emerged. And then later, so he, much beloved, everybody in Cambridge just adored Brother Blue. And he would wear what he called his rags. So he had on a tam, and he would wear butterflies all over his clothes and rainbow streamers, and all blue, but a lighter blue than his wife. Well, then later I learned that he was this Harvard guy who had distinguished himself in World War II, attended Harvard. I found him in the Harvard yearbook at the encouragement of Sarah Jasmine Griffin. She said, go look in the yearbooks and see. Yeah. And I was like, well, how did he go from being this Du Boisian looking, talented 10th, respectable type to this story, kind of like Black hippie storyteller? Mm-hmm. And for me, there's something about the model that he offered of sort of going, to borrow from Baldwin, going the way your blood beats, and taking all of that knowledge and his own personal wounds. And I won't tell all of them because I want people to read the book, but
right.
But had quite a number of personal tragedies, and taking all of that and becoming a storyteller as a way of providing, I think, of a kind of ethical instruction to everybody in this very heady, very intense, achievement-oriented little city. And when you look at the list of people who wrote tributes to him after he died, it's everybody. It's like, all these Nobel Prize laureates, and they tell really intimate stories about what he offered them. And he certainly offered me a great deal. I felt something closer to home when I was in their presence as a kid, when I had left my home,
Which I feel like is a really important point, too, because you've talked about how you're living in exile, right? Birmingham is still kind of home. And all of these other places where people are like, no, you're from Philly. You're like, actually, no. Or you're from Cambridge. No. But I do think that your sense of exile might be alleviated somewhat by story, right? Like, it's the stories that ground us. It's watching Blue sort of weave through not just Shakespeare, but music. Mm-hmm. And, you bring in Lorna Simpson, who's an artist I love. Oh, her stuff is so good. All of these elements, right? Mm-hmm. And the idea that it can come back to something as simple as a color, and then you start thinking deeply about color, and you're like, oh, but there are multiple shades, and the intersection of black and blue is a bruise, right? Like, colloquially, that's how right. We use it. It's all of these different moments, but it all comes back to story.
Right. And it becomes back to story and curation. Mm-hmm. I think of curation as a life practice that we do build ourselves through the stories we tell about who we are and where we've come from. And we tell, but also we provide ourselves with, we make choices about the story. There are literally millions, and this is the same thing with history. There are millions and millions of facts in our lives and in human history, and we make choices about how we pull from them and organize them in ways that allow us to make sense of ourselves, but also allow us to get up every day. It doesn't feel like we want to get up. A lot that keeps us from getting up. So that's part of the task. Story
for me too is also markers of evolution. Right? Like, have we actually made progress? It's not just the language choices we make. But it's the process that gets us to the choices of language. And I love the idea that you can pull something off the shelf, right, from like 1957. And maybe it pings again, right? Maybe it pings in 2025 and maybe it doesn't, and that's okay. And you do not have to leave it on the shelf.
Right.
Or you find something that was written maybe in 2022 and you're like, wow, this is not aging well. And here we are in 2025. This is not aging well. And that to me, that is such a huge part of why I also bounce between, novels and story collections and poetry and nonfiction, whether it's memoir or history or, am I reading math books? I am not reading math books. But I do like puzzling through, and I know you've said this before in other books, but, this idea that you bring the language, right? But you still need someone to respond to the language.
Yeah.
So sometimes it's a listener, sometimes it's a reader, but you need someone to respond to the language. Mm-hmm. And that the ideas themselves need the language.
The language. Yeah. And they need this, and they need story.
Yep.
Human beings, it's part of how we process information. We need and one of the difficult things about the transition from traditional academic writing for me, which I always feel I always want to keep the research component of academic inquiry tends to be focused on argument as a right, and an argument is not so inviting,
right,
to the listener. And also tends to distance emotion. I'm not interested in a sort of hardline distinction between feeling and thought. I think they are always close companions, which is tricky now in the age of both information and disinformation. There's
it is
happening. So we don't want to fetishize emotion. We have to be skeptical about it, but we also do want to be open to knowing that can shape our emotional reactions.
I don't want to lose nuance.
Oh, yeah.
I don't want to lose nuance. And there are times where I feel like as I move through the world, as I move through our shared world, there are times where I feel like someone has taken a sledgehammer to nuance and there is no space for that. And I am not saying make excuses. I am not saying accept the unacceptable. That is not what I'm saying. But I do think that there is something to be said for a rigor of investigation, that there is something to be said for a baseline, a shared baseline that allows sort of movement to and from, and rigidity is not that interesting.
It's not.
And extremes are not that interesting. And I think you have much more opportunity to evolve when you can approach a text as something to be engaged with rather than poked at with a stick. Right.
I think but I will say for me, this is part of what I have learned from fiction, because good novelists tend to be better at nuance because you have to, if you're going to create portraits of human beings that are compelling, they have to be nuanced and complex. So there's a way that the techniques of composing fiction I find are useful for nonfiction if we want to treat other human beings in our midst with the kind of nuance that not just that they deserve, but actually that helps us understand things, right? I mean, they sort of hardline positions, and I do understand them at certain moments. But even if you take them, you should have nuance in your understanding, right? If you say, I want to understand what's happening here, even if you say these things are unacceptable and I won't engage, but I do want to know what's happening with these, I refuse to engage with. What's happening with this question I refuse to engage with. It's just important in order to do something in the world to get it.
I want to jump back to South to America for a second because Richard Wright, your relationship with the writer Richard Wright and his work sort of to me represents exactly what you were just talking about, right? Like you were because he was always sort of taught as this, like, you have to be careful of his politics. He's this crazy Marxist. Like what? He's a madman. And you're like, well, I kind of always held him at arm's length, but your relationship with the work has evolved over time. And he's still Richard Wright. I mean, Black Boy is a seminal American novel. Like this is like, if you want to hold a mirror up to who we are, this is a good place to start. Can we go back to Richard Wright for a second and sort of use him as that example?
Yeah, because, with even more so with Native Son, where he basically is like, I'm going to create this character, who has been so beaten down by this that he has no redeemable qualities. Becomes James Baldwin's critique of, in his essay Alas, Poor Richard, right? What you have evacuated this character of all of the beauty of Black life and community. Right? But Richard Wright was what I realized, and so, the Bigger Thomas is not a real person. He is a product of a social reality. But the thing that's so tricky is that Richard Wright was such an extraordinary writer that he actually fails in making him someone who you don't feel for. Right? And there are these, and he has these like incredible moments because he observes the world. I mean, the way that he writes about, and so then shifting to Black Boy, realizing the way that he could write about nature and the beauty of the Southern landscape, the very landscape that was a source of his suffering, the way that he talked in Black Boy about hunger in his childhood, the way that he talked about, the baths and the tin tub, all of these, the sensual details are actually speak to a kind of complexity and nuance that he didn't want to acknowledge in terms of his assertions about the world, like that as an artist he couldn't avoid. And
right.
More I read him, and I continue to read him, he, just unbelievably gifted, but also someone who just mastered craft. So I don't want, I almost don't want to say the word gifted because it diminishes how much he labored. He's an incredible artist. And I think that if I had just dismissed him out of hand politically, I would not have been able to continue to learn from him. And I want to be able to do that. So.
Have you started working on the next thing?
Yes.
Okay. I know enough to know we will leave it at the yes. I'm just delighted to know that there's I like the way your brain works. I like this whole like chasing the story. Let's just figure out what it becomes kind of thing. Because again, I don't want to separate art from the day to day. Like I want all of the pieces. I think if we're going to walk around in the world, liberal arts education, big believer in liberal arts education.
Right. And even though there's a lot of hostility towards it now, it's so wonderful to be able to think about what it means to be a human being and to create just such, yeah. There's this quote from Lorraine Hansberry where she describes living on the South Side of Chicago as a place where living is a protest.
Yeah.
And what she's talking about is actually living with a sense of joy and play and beauty and refusal of the degradation that is cast upon. We need that. And she's not talking about like the way people talk about in a pejorative way about identity. She's talking about actually refusing the constraints that are placed upon people in justice. I love that.
I think that just drops us right back into the whole books give you a runway.
They do.
They give you a runway that is full of imagination. And if you meet it with curiosity, it's just like you can do a million different things. And even sort of knock down some deeply held ideas that maybe are slightly outdated and might be worth saying, hey, that doesn't quite work for me anymore.
Yeah, I think we have to be willing to challenge ourselves
Mm-hmm.
and it requires courage. But if we ever needed courage, we need it now. So
that actually seems like a really good place to end this conversation. Even though you and I could keep going, we could have our own series. We could just keep going for forever and a day. But I think this is where I'm going to say, Imani Perry, thank you so much for joining us on Poured Over. Black in Blues is out now. And I'm just going to say it again. If you haven't somehow read South to America, it is a must read. It's in paperback. You can find it anywhere. The biography of Lorraine Hansberry is great. Breathe is beautiful. There are a couple of books that I'm also missing, sorry, but those are the 4 that sort of stick close to me at any given moment. So thank you again, Imani.
Thank you so much, Miwa.
Thank you for listening. Poured Over is a Barnes & Noble production. To help other readers find us, please rate and review the show wherever you listen to podcasts.